a few more minutes.
I mean, I have all the playlists that we got on this just to start. Are you familiar with them? Ocean sound.
That's where the 3,950 people are, right?
They're all watching, connected.
On the screen of the stadium.
And they will see it also later then. So
Right.
think about it.
Longevity, the profoundness of what we are saying.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm being recorded, so I can use a bit on screen.
You would do anyway.
Of course. Especially if you see my tweets on Facebook. So yeah, no, but we can take some examples and use them somehow. I promise to be nice, if you're nice to me.
Oh, we always not.
Available for says the European Commission.
This is on, you know.
Just kidding. It was such a bad joke. Such a bad joke. I always say the wrong joke.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's very obvious that disinformation is not a big problem anymore, given the audience which is present here, but I have been told that this is live streamed, so a lot of people will probably be looking at it behind their computers, not taking so much kerosene in the air to fly up here. And also for people that want to watch it later on, which is especially true for the panel, I guess, because people in the panel probably want to know what they actually have been saying. You can also take a look at the video later on. My name is Madeleine de Kock-Buning. I am or was the chair of the high-level group on disinformation. I'm a part-time professor at the EUI, the European University Institute, and the chair of the regulatory authority to the Dutch media. And I'm your moderator today, and we have this excellent lineup. But before we talk about the lineup of excellent people behind me, I will take you through how this all started. It started, at least for me and Alexis, with the high-level group on disinformation, an expert group erected by the European Commission. It consisted of 39 members, experts, but also stakeholders, we must admit, from civil society, social media, media platforms, news and media, and academia. And it was quite a diverse, but really excellent group to be working with. And our objective was to advise the Commission. And honestly, disinformation is a topic that gets a lot of emotions flowing, so it was a very interesting process to be in together. The first meeting was the 15th of January. And well, if you look at the timeline, the whole process actually started with Stratcom, which was the task force that was erected already in 2015 with the request of the member states. And then we had, you see over there, the first meeting of the high-level group in January. And then we were supposed to already give our advice in the spring. And we were given 6 weeks. I was able to make 7 out of that, but that was quite a short time to do this difficult job. But the good thing was that since we were all in this pressure cooker, we were able to come up with an advice. It would be really great if we would, shut down our phone. Thank you so much. No worries. It's always one that happens that. Well, what was our task? The task of the high-level group on disinformation was to scope the phenomenon, which was already not so easy to do. as you know, as it is a very complex phenomenon. We were defining the roles and responsibilities also of all the stakeholders involved, because you can imagine in disinformation many stakeholders are involved, and some of them had already taken action, at least some action. Then we were there to grasp the international dimension, which was rather important as well. Then we took stock of the position at stake, and then, and that was the most difficult part, we had to come up with an advice. And as I told you, we were able to come up with a rather consistent multidimensional advice. The report gives, well, you can find it online, it gives a rather clear problem definition, and it also gives a whole list of measures that already have been taken. It defines key principles because, of course, as you know, disinformation is not about hate speech, it's that what it's not illegal, so we are in a fundamental rights perspective very much so. And we defined 5 responses and actions, and then we also gave some instructions to, or advice, but they were put in a little bit of a, well, condensed way, so they were more or less instructions by the stakeholders. So let me go further on that. Do we have to leave the building now? What's going on? Nothing important, no disinformation warfare going on here? Okay, very good. Very good for you. So we have formulated 5 pillars, and we very much still believe in those 5 pillars, and the excellent idea is that also the Commission has taken up most of our advice. The first one is, and that is very important for society resilience against disinformation, safeguard the diversity and sustainability of the European news ecosystem. That is extremely important also to dilute disinformation. Again, and then another important pillar was to promote and sharpen the use of media literacy, again to improve the societal resilience against disinformation. And furthermore, also develop tools to empower both journalists and users to be able to work with disinformation, enhance the transparency of the online ecosystem, and lastly, also really make sure that what you promise, that is also going on. So this is the way we have a checking loop to avoid window dressing. And already this was quite an achievement, and I'm extremely proud of the high-level group for this, but we even formulated 10 key principles, and those 10 key principles were used in the Code of Practices and further there that were developed by the platforms such as Facebook. Mark is sitting right here. So that was our approach. We had some recommendations for all stakeholders involved, and I would like to point out the first one towards the Commission, because that was, of course, the most important one. Create a multi-stakeholder coalition against disinformation, and be very clear that you monitor self-regulatory measures and establish, and this is also something we are still furthering, European Centers for Research on Disinformation. Because when you start to create policy, you better know what exactly you are creating policy on. Also for the long term, we have some advices, and we also gave advice to the member states. And of course, this is something that turns out to be more and more important every day. Member states should refrain themselves from interfering with editorial independence of media. For the other stakeholders, such as the platforms, we advise to create a code of practices, and this is exactly what happened. This is how I was able to present the code. You see a lot of relief on my face to Marie-Gabrielle, our advice of the high-level group. And then, based on our advice, there was an excellent communication by the Commission, a code of practice on disinformation, an independent European network of fact-checkers, Alexis will be talking about later on, a secure European online platform on disinformation, and again, enhancing media literacy, something we will also be talking about today. Also, the promotion of voluntary online identification systems, very important to know where the source is coming from, support for the quality and diverse information, again, to dilute disinformation, and also support member states to ensure resilience of elections. And then another part, and there's some discussion going on that, and I would like you guys also to join us in that, a coordinated strategic communication policy aimed at countering false narratives about Europe and tackling disinformation within and outside the EU. Let's talk about that a bit later on. And now, at the end of 2018, a lot of things happened, and we would like with you to take stock of them, and together also with this perfect panel. A code of practice on online disinformation is already in place. It was agreed upon by online platforms and the advertising industry, which was notably also involved in this code. It also has been criticized, so I'm sure we're also going to talk about that a bit later on. And then also an independent network of fact-checkers, very important, that are being created right now, also to strengthen the capacity to detect and debunk false narratives. Also, some topics we need to be working on towards the future is increased levels of media literacy, support of quality journalism, and the Commission also said that it would be closely monitoring that. Well, I can tell you something new. There will be an action plan, the action plan that was already announced by President Juncker in his State of the Union. It will be published tomorrow at 1 o'clock on the 5th of December. So please all watch out what will be in that action plan exactly. A big cliffhanger, it would have been nice to know it today, but unfortunately, we will know about it tomorrow. So, today we are talking about disinformation to support democracy. We see a large challenge, a much larger challenge for the spread of disinformation at this moment, and especially, and that is the topic of today, we see that the European Parliament election is coming up and also a lot of national elections. So how to deal with disinformation issues in the meantime. I would like to talk about that with this panel and also with you as the audience. Stakeholder citizen engagement, comprehensive policy responses, innovative technologies, and forward-looking research. And we will do that with this excellent panel. First of all, we will have a keynote by Marcus from Facebook. Then we will have Alexis from the International Fact Check Network. We will have Aaron Simpson from the Civil Society lead in the Oxford Internet Institute. We will have Frank, because I promised to say just Frank and not to slaughter your name, the founder and CEO of Semantic Visions. Then we will have Sophie, Professor of Communication Science here in the University of Vienna. And we will have lastly Raju from the Columbia University School of Journalism, Professor of Professional Practice. So thank you so much for being here, panel. Thank you for being here, audience. Please take the floor, Marcus, and enlighten us with some of the initiatives of Facebook.
I'll try my best. Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you for your very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to kick off this tremendous panel that we have here. I have my own theory why it's maybe a little bit more intimate here than it usually would be, is that this conference takes place in Vienna, which is probably one of the most fantastic cities, and I think a lot of people might be wandering through town and admire the pre-Christmas Vienna today. And I'm not flattering the organizers because I am actually from Vienna. I grew up here. And I'm very, very pleased to be back in my hometown again. I don't think that the reason why I'm here is because I'm the local boy. One of the other reasons I think is because I'm representing Facebook, which is one of the larger multinational companies that has a heightened responsibility when it comes to protecting democracy and to fight against misinformation. And I think Many companies have social responsibilities. That's not unusual. You know, companies try to protect the interests of their customers. They try to protect the environment. They try not to distort markets, and that all is true for Facebook. But I think we are quite unusual because of the effect that we have on the social discourse and on democracy. And I think because we all care about democracy, we are here today. And for democracy to function, it needs a number of things, but I think it needs 3 key tenets. And the first one is that we have accurate news and not fake news. I think we need free speech, and we don't need false speech. And we need trust, transparency, and we need accountability. And this is, as I said, the key pillars of a functioning democracy. But incidentally, it is also what a sustainably operating platform needs to be successful. So what I want to do over the next couple of minutes is I want to speak a little bit about what Facebook is doing to address these challenges. And I actually want to also say something about what Facebook maybe should stop doing in this field. Because what we need to, I think, constantly keep in mind is that the issues that we're discussing here, they are much, much bigger than a single company. They're much bigger than an industry. And it does need other stakeholders as well. It needs the state, obviously, to get involved. And I want to say something about the role of the state in this discussion. And then I want to come sort of to maybe a more forward-looking point. And this is the fact that we are actually operating in a relatively new space. And this is sort of the intersection between technology and society. And what's happening here is that there's the creation of what I would call a semi-public space. And I think it's very important that we are aware of this, that we sort of find the right language, the definition of what this semi-public space is, and to find sort of the right framework and how we operate in this environment. So why does it all matter? Well, I think it does matter because our democracy and democracy as we know it is challenged. And in the latest annual report of an independent think tank, some of you will know them, it's Freedom House, they have established and they have found that political rights and civil liberties are declining at the fastest rate and at the lowest points for almost a generation. And what they're seeing is that those countries that have democratic setbacks are now outweighing those that make gains. And it's a long discussion, you know, to go into the details. Why is this all happening? But I do think there's sort of some ground truth in there. And one of that is the rapid spread and the rapid rise of globalization, and then the very unequal distribution of the benefits of globalization. And at the same time, we see a gradual decline of the trust in institutions, in political institutions. And you know, what sits at the heart of it, things like, you know, go back decades, like the Iraq War, for example, or the financial crisis of 2008 and the austerity measures that came with that, or the Euro crisis. And one of the many effects that has is that we see an increased radicalization, but also we see a polarization of the political discourse. And we see populism. We see populism across Europe. We see populism in this country. And this is something that needs to be taken into consideration when we look at the effect of this more divisive dialogue. And it's not just the macroeconomic and these macro-political developments that affect this. Technology has to play and is playing a role as well in this. And I believe at heart personally that technology is a democratizing force. It is giving power in the hands of people. It allows people to communicate, it allows them to agitate, it allows them to coordinate. And what it really does is it brings down the entry barriers to political and to democratic participation, which is, I think, an extremely important function that social networks and technology plays. And social networks help with the amplification of positive content, but at the same time, it can flip around, and it helps also with the amplification of the negative. And if we leave this completely unchecked, we will have the issue, and we've seen this on our platform on almost a daily basis, that people will try to abuse and misuse these tools. They will spread misinformation, they will try to interfere in elections, and they will try to incite violence. And for that reason, we have to really work super hard to find a balance between 3 pillars. And the one is that people get connected. There's an extreme utility and benefit for people in there. And also to give people voice, to allow them to express their ideas, to express their thoughts. But at the same time, we need to ensure that people stay safe on the platform. And that balance, that creation of this balance becomes ever more important in a time where the dialogue is becoming ever more polarized. We have to ask ourselves a couple of questions here. Question number one is, are there limitations to freedom of speech? And do we have a right as a platform to limit freedom of speech? The second question is, how do we decide what is distributed on the platform and what is blocked on the platform? And I think probably important for all of you here is, who actually makes those decisions? Who makes those policy decisions? And who makes these decisions to enforce these policies? And finally, who is then accountable for this? And these are issues, as I said before, they are bigger than a single company. I think this requires a joint up, a dialogue between the private sector and between the state, because we're not just having a relationship with technology, with the individual. What's happening on our platform is interfering with the social discourse. So let's have a look what the state's role is. And the state plays an extremely important role. And I'll take one example here. Take the GDPR. The privacy protection and data protection of individuals is a fundamental right. And it does need hard-coded regulation to protect those rights. And it also needs regulation to define new standards and also to harmonize, because a data world is actually a cross-border world where services are offered in a digital single market. And here we see a clear lead of the state together in consultation with other stakeholders. But there are limitations to what the state can do. And lawmaking is traditionally relatively slow. Regulations can be quite rigid, and again, this is not new. We have been there before. These shortcomings, they go across many industries, but it's specifically pronounced in the technology industry, where we have such a fast-moving environment, where we have different use cases, different products that change all of this very, very quickly. And I just want to sort of pick one analogy here, and if you might think about the car industry. In the car industry, the state plays an important role. The state sets the rules. It sets the rules for speeding, it sets the rules for drink driving, which actually only the state can do. But there have been safety innovations which are at least as important to the lives and the health of people as these rules are, which is the development of the seatbelt, of the ABS, of the airbag. And these innovations would never have come from a rule book. So there is a clear role for the state, but it's not the only factor that defines an environment, safety environment going forward. And there's also a role of the state, and that might be maybe something slightly controversial, where I think the state is actually not yet stepping up to its responsibility when we talk about modern and digital societies. And I experience this every day with the decisions that I have to make, is that the state still outsources difficult, socially and politically sensitive decisions and interpretation of laws to private companies like ours. And I think that is also something that needs to be addressed. Let's have then a look at what a social media platform is doing well. Well, we can act very fast. We can move immediately when we have to protect our users. And we see many, many things in real time and act in real time that to many of you is completely invisible. And I give you one example. In the recent elections in Brazil, we spotted posts that were claiming that the election day was moved, that was fake news, and we spotted that within an hour and took that post down within an hour to prevent it from going viral. So these are things that can only happen on a platform itself. But there's one home truth, and I think Madalena was speaking about this before. People do lie, and people do lie on platforms, and it is very, very difficult for platforms to spot these lies. And we have a policy that doesn't prevent you from lying on a platform. Because that would be and create interference into your rights to express yourself. But we do not like misinformation, and we do everything against misinformation because misinformation at scale creates division and creates polarization. And that's the reason why we are spending an enormous amount of resources to tackle misinformation. And that is not just artificial intelligence, which we use a lot as well, but we're using human resources. And just to give you sort of a scale of the magnitude that we're operating here, Facebook, as we speak today, has 30,000 people working on protecting the integrity of the platform, on reviewing the content that is posted by users. So this is a significant contribution that we are making. And we are tackling information in various ways. One of them, and one of the most effective one, is to take down fake accounts. Fake accounts are the single most factor that is spreading fake news. And what we manage at the moment is that we can actually spot 98% of all fake accounts before they even go live. And if you, again, want to get sort of a scale how big the problem is, in the last 6 months, we've taken down 1.5 billion fake accounts. So this is what we do together with artificial intelligence and human reviewers. But it's not just the taking down of fake accounts. It is also stopping the spread of misinformation. And this is what we're doing with fact-checking, and Alexios will be saying a little bit about this as well. But there's one thing that we're working on very, very hard, and we've just announced this a couple of weeks ago, is how we deal with so-called borderline content. And borderline content is content that is not illegal, that is not violating our community standards, which is the rule book that decides what content can stay on and comes off our platform. It is sensationalist content. It is polarizing content. And what we see is that our users do engage more with this borderline content than with other forms of content. And it doesn't really matter where we sort of draw the line of this borderline content. Wherever the line is, the engagement goes up as soon as content reaches this borderline. And therefore, we are training our artificial intelligence to spot this borderline content. And if a borderline content is detected, we start to distribute that content less. And this is a way to disincentivize things like clickbait. Let me then just talk a little bit about transparency. Transparency is very important because we have upcoming elections in Europe. We have in May the European parliamentary elections. And transparency with regards to elections is, and political advertisement is one of our core strategies and our core tasks that we're working on now. And because we really, really care that those advertisements are who they say they are. And what we do here is that we have and give you the ability as a user to look at every advertisement and to see which ads this page is running in parallel. And what this does is it addresses the issue of dark ads, where polarizing ads addressing different groups are put by the same groups. So this is something that is very key and is already operational on our platform. And what we will be introducing before the elections in spring is a product that we already have running in the US, in the UK, but also in Brazil, is to authenticate political advertisers, to label political advertisements, but also to create a searchable archive, to give the chance for the media, to give the chance for academia to see trends in political advertisement on the platform. Let me just come to my last point on these semi-public spaces. You know, I think even if we do our best, even if the state does its best, we still have a lot of issues that remain unresolved because some of these really knotty and difficult questions in the future are at this crossroads of technology and society. And therefore, we need new regulatory, new models to tackle this. And we are working together with governments. We're working also together with the European Commission to come up with these new models. And some of you might have seen the work that we're doing with France, where President Macron announced a couple of weeks ago that we are developing and working on co-regulatory models with the French government on assessing new ways to regulate content. So this is, I think, a very important step in the right directions. And we've heard from Madalena the work that is done on the Code of Misinformation, and there's more work that we will do with the Commission. But it's filling me with a lot of confidence that we are all going in the same direction here. And just let me close and say, yes, we do have considerable challenges here, but I'm actually very optimistic and excited that we can work on new models, on new regulatory models, on co-regulatory models that help us to achieve the common goal that we have, is to harness the benefit of technology and also the benefit of democracy while we limit and minimize its harms.
Thank you, Marcus. Just one short question for you. You just told us that state outsources decisions to platforms and that you would like to discuss about that. But on the other hand, you also explained to us that you are deciding on what is borderline content, and also, well, in a way, deciding on what is truth. Do you think governments should outsource that kind of activities to platforms like Facebook?
Well, I think first, the government should not outsource difficult decisions to Facebook. And what I was actually referring to is what we're currently asked to do in Germany with the NetzDG, where we actually have to define what hate speech is, which is extremely difficult. And it's very difficult that if somebody appeals against it in a German court, then the German court or the German state then is reinstating the content that we were just asked under law to remove. So that's some of the things where I think we're not in the right position. What I didn't say before is when we talk about borderline content, which is, I think, a very positive thing to do, that we actually do give the options to the user to disable it. So it will be a default setting, but if you do not want to be excluded from borderline content, you can switch that off as a function. So the user has to be in control in things like this, and I don't think that that specifically is interfering into state decision power. It is interfering in what you as a user can do with and what you can see, but you have the ability to switch that off on the same side. But I think, you know, your question maybe goes in a slightly different direction as well, is actually Facebook doing too much? You know, are we making decisions with regards to content, with regards to hate speech, which sometimes border political speech? And here, I think we're coming ever more to the conclusion that is the case, and that we actually have to step back from some of these decisions. And something I wanted to mention before as well is that we have announced 2 weeks ago that we actually will create an independent third-party appeals panel where independent experts can decide on very, very tricky content decisions. These decisions will be binding on Facebook, and this is something that we want to implement during the year of 2019 to address your point.
Okay. Yeah, because, well, the fact that Facebook is actually deciding on what is truth in a way is, of course, a risk. But we'll be talking about it later on. Alexis, can I give you the floor and the clicker? You have that already? Great.
Hey, how y'all doing?
From Poitner. Hi.
Good, good. While someone puts my slides up, I'm going to try that again. Hey, how are we all doing? Everyone okay? Yeah. All right, that's better. So we're here to talk solutions. So I've lots of thoughts on the whole problem side, but one part of the solutions is going to have to be more and better fact-checking at continental scale. I don't think this is a silver bullet by any means. But it's going to be a necessary element of the next 6 months, the next few years. So, but first let me take a step back and say that the 2019 European parliamentary elections risk offering the perfect conditions for a tremendous storm of misinformation, right? The EU is historically a place and a topic where there is low awareness of basic facts. In the 2016 Brexit referendum, Ipsos surveyed Brits, and only 6 out of 10 of those surveyed correctly indicated that MEPs were directly elected, leaving 40% of those surveyed with a pretty hazy idea of European democracy. And this has been historic and across the continent. But to compound this challenge, we're seeing more and better coordinated misinformation actions, and this is where I'd love for the slides to be up if we can. Whereas economically motivated fakers kind of seed false reports that mutate slightly from country to country, carried either by sloppy journalism or unwitty users. There we go, perfect. So on the left, a fact checker doesn't like to talk without sources. So these are my sources. On the left, the Ipsos poll, and on the right, an example of a false news story that did really well across Europe, whereas a documentary about the Greek exodus from Asia Minor was recast as allegedly a staged video of refugees drowning so as to sort of increase this stuff. So if you mix these two things together, we're going to have a pretty messy situation ahead of May 2019, or we can. And just even more recently, we saw a hoax it was like the perfect trifecta of a fake story. The UN, Soros, refugees, all meshed together. And it was first found and fact-checked in France. A day later, it was found and fact-checked in the Netherlands. A week later, it was found and fact-checked in Italy. It also appeared in Austria, in Sweden, in Croatia. I'm not going to go into the details about it. We can talk about that. But essentially, we're seeing hoaxes do very well in the European context by sort of going from country to country and mutating and taking advantage of the continental scale. So if misinformers are going to be collaborating and working at a continental scale, so I believe fact checkers should, and that's the idea of the Fact Check EU Alliance that's going to be launched in January. It will include all the EU signatories of the International Fact-Checking Network that I lead, and put together sort of a curated feed of all relevant fact checks translated in 10 EU countries, but in 10 EU languages, excuse me. But above all, a strong way to detect what readers are interested in or care about or are reading about the EU. Why do I say this? 5 years ago, I also ran a website called Fact Check EU, and it was very popular in the Brussels bubble, and no one outside of it ever heard of it. So we want to make sure that we're offering stuff that actually the average EU voter is seeing on their feed. That means working with Google and getting stuff out of trends. That means that we'll be conducting polls across the continent to see what basic facts people get wrong, and that means that there'll be a very, very strong Q&A component to it. And the third and final element is that we'll be tracking these hoaxes that travel, right? Because usually if they travel, there is a network as well. Some of this is organic. Oh, that's a clickbaity good story over there. Some of this is, if not orchestrated, well organized, right? There are misinforming players that seed their information accordingly. And that's something that's useful to note, because if I click on a single fake news story, the refugee video, the alleged fake drowning video that I said before, I'm like, whatever, one false story. But if you uncover that actually the same domains are pushing it across, or that the domains are owned by the same organization across countries, then that becomes something that people should be more aware of. To wrap up, I do think there are going to be some challenges here. I mentioned a moment ago that this has been attempted in a very different form a while ago, but audiences tend to care about their national politics much more than the EU politics. Think about your own country and how people are preparing to the European parliamentary elections. Often they're preparing it as a referendum on the internal situation. So it'll be rest to see whether offering EU fact-checking at an EU level will will be of interest, I guess, to the public. The EU institutions, and particularly Parliament, has seen fact-checking as something that is inherently on their side, which is absurd and bizarre. I have several arguments with MEPs in Brussels who argued that Brexit happened because of fake news, and we can have a very long debate about whether you guys think that's true or not. My personal vision is that's incredibly reducting and not true. But there is this sense in the EU institutions that fact-checking inevitably will shore up the EU. That's not what it's there to do, but the more there is from EU institutions this type of approach, the more we poison the well. And I'm thinking also of institutions within the External Action Service. I don't need to go into more detail. And then the platforms are a challenge. I think, Facebook has partnered with fact checkers, including full disclosure through a partnership that we helped happen. We don't get any money for it, but we did make it happen. And I think that's been helpful in the US. If you look at the 2016 elections versus the 2018 elections, we have seen Pope endorses Donald Trump style fake stories go down. But the politically motivated stuff, the non-Macedonian clickbaity stuff, so to speak, is harder to remove from platforms. It's harder not to remove, to flag and highlight and downrank. And there are reasons for that, because political speech should be protected in various ways. So that's going to be a more challenging milieu. Just one sentence on opportunities, because otherwise it's a pretty damn gloomy way to close on something that we're building. We think that working together means that the 3 fact checks in 10 days that you saw before were actually going to be all at the same time, the same day you have the 1 fact check of a partner, and everyone across the EU knows that that story is a hoax, and so we can get fact checks out faster to more people. We expect to reach up to 25 million page views per month with this project, given who the partners are. And as I mentioned before, we hope to provide through this platform a sense of, hey, actually falsehoods are being used in similar ways across the continent, either on social media, by politicians, etc. So to conclude, I do think that, tackling disinformation to support democracy needs collaboration, it needs nonpartisanship, and it needs kind of a cool mind and evidence-based interventions. So I hope we're going to have all those for the next 6 months. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexis from Pointner. I've got one short question for you. How do you make sure that the work of the EU fact-checkers will be completely independent, although they're partially privately funded? Because you hear a lot of, well, worry about that. So tell me, what do you do to avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. First of all, there is a code of principles that our organization puts out, and that requires external assessors to evaluate each of these organizations on 12 points that include whether their funding is transparent, whether their biographies are transparent, how their methodology is conducted. So we, I think we go for trust through transparency rather than trust through authority. All our sources are there, and all who we are and how we work is there. So that's a way to prove sort of impartiality. The other thing of collaborating at the EU scale is that maybe you can buy out one organization, but buying out 20 organizations of such different, you go from the AFP to a NGO in Germany to a small media startup in Italy to, so like there's such diversity in the groups that we expect that will be a strong component of it too.
Okay, thank you so much. Very good. Aaron Simpson of the Oxford Internet Institute, please go ahead. Do you have, yes, you have already the clicker, great.
Wonderful, thank you, Madeline, good afternoon. My name is Aaron Simpson. I'm with the Oxford Internet Institute and the Computational Propaganda Research Project. We're a multidisciplinary international research institute based at Oxford University. We look into the use of big data analytics, algorithms, and automation to manipulate public life. Over the past 6 years, we've used both quantitative and qualitative methods to look at algorithmically driven political messaging, disinformation, and junk news in more than 30 countries. Recently, that's included in Europe, elections in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, most recently Sweden as well, the Brexit referendum in the UK, and will include the upcoming EU parliamentary elections in 2019. In terms of global trends, in this year's report, we saw significant growth in the number of media manipulation cases worldwide. Represented in orange above, there are 48 countries where we found evidence of formally organized operations by government agencies and/or political parties to exploit social media platforms to manufacture consensus, spread junk news and disinformation, exercise censorship and control, and undermine the trust in media, public institutions, and science. In about a fifth of these, we found evidence of disinformation campaigns operating over chat applications such as WhatsApp, Telegram, and WeChat. Overall, we're seeing rapid iteration of and innovation in computational propaganda techniques. Today, I've been asked to comment very briefly on strategies for responding to online disinformation. Our organization is a research group, and the nature of our research is not into the efficacy of solutions, but into the character, scope, and operation of the problem. But indeed, looking to our understanding of the problem and the nature of the problem may help illuminate the challenge here in the nature of the solution. In that sense, I want to put to the room that disinformation is a socio-technical problem, and I'd like to argue that it will require socio-technical solutions. Now, this insight was brought to the problem this year by scholar Alice Marwick and her powerful Georgetown Law Technology Review piece on why people share fake news. And I think this is a useful frame for understanding the nature of the issue at hand. Disinformation is partially a technical problem. Although propaganda itself is as old as time, the current digital media environment enables unprecedented scale, precision, and profit in pushing propaganda. But disinformation is also partially a social problem. Bad actors wishing to destabilize democratic process tap into existing social divisions to more quickly and authentically spread false, hateful messages and exacerbate those divisions, including racism, sexism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and more. They co-opt existing public conversation and interest in these topics in order to maximize the reach and engagement of propaganda. In some cases, this strategy might work because people aren't able to distinguish fact from fiction online. Perhaps they don't have the media literacy tools to know better or a trusted source to correct the record for them. But oftentimes, as Marwick shows in her piece, and as I've heard firsthand from civil society leaders around the world, other people who spread disinformation online do so not because they think it's true or care that it's true, but because of the social motivations. They do it to feed their social identities and garner attention, approval, and solidarity from those in their social groups. Put another way, the social payoff that someone racist gets from sharing something racist online is being used to spread disinformation. Thus, to address only the technical affordances of the problem is to miss the social dynamics at play. So in this instance, fact-checking and media literacy campaigns are essential to equipping social media users with the resources they need to more capably navigate an online environment rife with, to Alexios's point, not just false claims, but hyperbole, sensationalism, miscontextualization, conspiracy, and opinion masquerading as fact. However, to only address the unwitting spread of disinformation is to miss the problem of willful, eager participation. Looking to the future, as disinformation continues movement to private messaging platforms and more visual mediums, this challenge is only going to become more difficult. Thus, it's essential to continue to think proactively and strategically about our technical and regulatory strategies for addressing the spread of disinformation. But perhaps it's equally important that we seek understanding and more deeply consider on the social motivations for participating and spreading false content. So, to my point, democratic societies must grapple with both the technical affordances and the social divisions that are exploited by disinformation producers to succeed in fighting disinformation. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And if you're interested in reading our research or following along as we study the EU parliamentary election in 2019, you can sign up to receive updates at the address above. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we will be taking questions from the audience later on. But I have a short question for you right now. We see more and more spread of disinformation through WhatsApp. How do you envisage that? Is that more or less easy to deal with?
Well, WhatsApp is harder to deal with because WhatsApp is an encrypted person-to-person messaging platform that caps groups at 256 people. It is essential that we maintain the privacy and the anonymity on WhatsApp and other platforms that do offer users privacy. However, this also does lead to a new challenge for researchers, fact-checkers, and others trying to follow the spread of disinformation. Yes.
Yeah, so a new challenge for you. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I would now like to hand down the clicker to Frank. And Frank, please take, you want to be standing up or sitting down?
I would love to stand here.
Okay, please go.
So, may I ask you for the presentation? So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I am the founder and CEO of Semantic Visions. We are a Prague-based risk assessment firm. We have built and run one of the largest open source intelligence systems in the world. Open source doesn't relate to open source software, but to publicly available information. And we collect and analyze about 90% of the world's online news content. And we are one of the very few organizations or firms that are being able to see the big picture. Our bread and butter is risk detection with respect to millions of companies, and we work for the large multinational corporations. And as a part of our social responsibility, we are advising NATO headquarters on the big data and information warfare. I will be more straightforward now, and I will name the main source of disinformation, which is Russia. And I believe that I'm very well equipped for that because I'm coming from the Czech Republic, former Czechoslovakia, part of it, where we were occupied by Russians. It was just 50th anniversary on the 21st of August this year. We understand very well what the hostile propaganda and disinformation is because we have suffered that for over 2 decades. We're doing that because of this quote. So the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is good men to do nothing. We started to address this problem publicly when we came to this slide from our system, which shows a clear negative trend 2 years before in Russian media with respect to Ukraine, even before 2 years before the annexation of Crimea. There's no other interpretation that the Russian leadership wanted to change the public opinion, which was positive to Ukraine. What we found from our big data is, unfortunately, that the public opinion is basically nothing else but a mirror display of a critical mass of what is being written in the online media. The first task that we outlined for us was to prove that something like Russian propaganda exists, because there's so many people in Europe and the world that still don't believe it. So we took a neutral, I would say politically neutral topic. This is the number of articles per day on Olympic Games in Sochi, and compare it with the English content compared to the Russian one. So we see usual proportion in our system, 1:6, and the same pattern. And here we have a politically explosive topic on the downing the MH17. We see completely different picture. If we take a closer look, in the Russian, in the case of MH17, and on the bottom part you see downing of the Metrojet, the Russian airplane by Islamic State over Sinai. So we see 2 completely different pictures, which we found as a proof of Russian propaganda and that Russians are lying. By the way, this analysis was published by the MIT Technology Review. So if there's someone in the audience or on the web still hesitating or not believing that Russia is lying, so this is the quote of Russian General Nikolai Borduzha, who is the former Secretary of Security Council of Russian Federation and the current General Secretary of Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is some sort of opposite of NATO. So the key narratives of Russian propaganda is relativization of truth, which is the main line of attack, because they attack our democracy, because their main goal is to dismantle democracy. And once we stop trusting our democratic authorities, the house will fall down. And here you may see the other narratives like anti-NATO, anti-EU, anti-United States, anti-sections, and of course, pro-Kremlin. Because I want to be politically correct, and since the disinformation starts on websites, here you see the analysis of the over 4,000 online sources from the Czech Republic, where just 22 of them produces over 60% of all Russian propaganda in our country. So unfortunately, Russian propaganda, Russian state uses social media as their main vehicle to disseminate and amplify their toxic messages. And in all openness, this is nothing else but just an implementation of the marketing and advertising practice which is being performed on Facebook and other social networks. The problem with Facebook is, I think, deeper than was discussed today, and that is that Facebook is inherently fragmentizing the society into the smallest information bubbles as possible, because that gives them the chance to expose them with as targeted ads as possible, which brings them much higher revenue. So what to do with the problem? Definitely work on the public awareness, policy maker awareness, name and shame toxic websites, and engage tech giants to blacklist and stigmatize these websites. This is not happening still. And of course, we should try to create a better social network, like make a second chance, appeal to the social responsibility of the tech giants, engage their vast resources to tackle disinformation. If we as a small company are able to detect disinformation in real time, they could definitely do it as well. And last, encourage the European Union to expand research into the effects of social networking, so we as users use social media platforms for the benefit of the world, not to its detriment. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Frank. A very short question of me. You depicted a really very black perspective. You even used black slides for that. You suggest, for instance, also, again, blacklisting. But don't you see a risk for blacklisting with regard to the fundamental rights we all want to protect by this discussion on disinformation?
Well, if you take a deeper look to the websites, I mean, at the end, there are not too many websites publishing truly hostile content. I think you will find that it is, I would say, almost impossible to digest the lies that they are publishing. And I think that we should stigmatize those websites, like, for example, we have stigmatized the children's pedophilia sites, for example. Simply, we have to, if not block them, then not to enable them to enter the public, the free internet through the social media platforms. This is my strong opinion.
Thank you for that. I would like to give Sophie the floor now.
Thank you.
Would you have the clicker
Thank
for
you.
Sophie?
I only have one slide, so
Okay,
you
don't need it.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all the previous speakers for your interesting remarks and for your great and inspirational talks. I am part of a political communication research group that studies the intersection of media, journalism, and political psychology, meaning that we're trying to find out what are the motivations that stand behind the spread of disinformation by looking at the individual, by looking at the different actors involved, and trying to find out what can be done, for example, to kind of hinder the spread of disinformation. And I want to highlight one aspect of that research today that perhaps complements also some of the things, for example, Erin said when she highlighted the sociological aspect of the spread of disinformation, meaning that by simply reinforcing a structure or reinforcing the technologies to stop the spread of disinformation, you're not actually doing the whole job. You have to look at the motivations that stand behind it, not only on an institutional level, but also on an individual level, on the level of the citizen. And my statement here for today would be that politics is not just a business of the minds, but also a business of the hearts. Let's see, sounds a little bit esoteric perhaps, but it really is looking at this idea that the way we process information, the way we understand information, the way we retain information, and also false information, leading to misperception, is very much based on our emotions. So for those of us who are interested in stopping the spread of misinformation, of disinformation, of fake news, or whatever you want to call it, we also need to be very invested in stopping the spread of emotion. And that really comes right into a whole discussion that's happening right now, where emotion are basically blamed for the whole fake news crisis, disinformation crisis, talking about sensational media, over-emotionalized public spheres, populist parties, and so on, using emotions to manipulate voters, to manipulate citizens across Europe and the world, and therefore paving the way for disinformation. Now, it is true that digitalization, the rise of social media platforms, and several other societal changes have increase the value emotions hold in our daily life, in our political lives, in our public lives. And buzzwords such as hate speech, truthiness, for example, things that are not actually true but feel true, for example, feel opinions instead of opinions, all highlight that perhaps bad aspect emotion plays in our lives. And I would not argue against that. Yes, over-emotionalization, sensationalism, using fear to incite hate and to go against certain groups in society is unarguably something we need to worry about. However, perhaps we can also turn that information or that an argument around, because by only focusing our efforts towards fact-checking, which is, the basis of tackling disinformation, by looking at just information, fact, we're basically disregarding a big part of how people use media and how people form their attitudes towards politics or their whole life. So there is movement within civil society, within elites, within citizens, organizations to use emotions in a more constructive way. I can give you some examples. Platforms such as Facebook, but others have in the past, maybe of a varying degree of public success, tried to look at how emotion spreads across their news feeds, across the way information is distributed. But research into that is very crucial. And I'm sure emotion, it must be also an indicator of what would qualify as problematic content, not just the truthiness, no, the factfulness of that information, but also what kind of emotions are being used. On a second level, media and journalists, who very much, we haven't really talked about them yet, but they still play a large role. I'm sure Raju will also speak about that. There are movements within political journalism and journalism as a field to use emotions in a constructive way to form news that are not only truthful, but that also appeal to a disenfranchised audience who is open for disinformation. So kind of tries to meet these people, not by good news. Now people always respond saying, oh yeah, you want only fluffy animals or happy videos. No, this is not about happy videos, even though we like cat videos. It's about constructive, solution-oriented journalism and reporting, and it's about institutions such as the European Commission also looking into research that is forward-looking and using emotions not to demonize media, not to demonize certain parts of politics, but to constructively understand how people work. Because people form opinions, people lead their lives based not only on information, but based on emotion, and we can't just dismiss these as bad. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Emotion as a human property. But you spoke a bit about journalists, and I was wondering, we are all aware of the fact that journalists struggle right now because it's very difficult to find time and tools to actually do something against disinformation. Sometimes they are even purifiers of disinformation themselves, and they have this strong bias also to bring emotionally attractive content to get the clicks or the eyeballs. So how would you put that within your theory, this practical situation of today, the media institutions really struggling and journalists mostly?
Well, the media are struggling, and journalists themselves speak of a crisis of trust, a crisis of journalism, a challenge for journalism. And it is true there are many things that have challenged journalism during the last decades, have to do with digitalization, but many other aspects of it. And then that's the response that you usually get. We have no time. How can we do this, right? We are stuck in this negativity spiral, the spiral of sensationalism, following things. Actually, there are media that show that there is a different way. There's one successful example from your own home country called The Correspondent. So The Correspondent is an online-only news outlet, a website that was started by a couple of disgruntled journalists who said, we're not gonna be in this rut any longer. We believe people will pay for quality. And this is a thought that was long already discarded. People are not gonna pay for content online. But actually their business model shows that people do. They work on members. They've recently expanded to the US market and try to do something that they call anti-cyclical news. The idea that they not just respond, but be proactive, be solution-oriented, exactly using these positive emotions to revolutionize the media market. And this could be something, if the traditional media don't follow, which some of them are, this could be something to change the media market completely. So we have to watch this. Yeah.
Well, that's a very positive angle indeed. Research also shows that people are not willing to pay for online news, so that makes it a bit more difficult on a general note. But it's true, The Correspondent is a very good example. Raju, I can imagine that you would also be talking about that a little bit further. The clicker, yeah. So please take the floor, Raju from Columbia.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to pull this back to some macro observations. The advantage of being last is I can do that. The disadvantage of being last is a lot of the observations have been made already. But I wanted to reiterate a couple of things. One is misinformation is really a wicked problem. Wicked not in terms of like evil, but in terms of the complexity of solutions, whether there's incomplete information, whether there's too many people involved and too many opinions need to be put together. There's a large economic burden for solving this issue. There's an interconnected nature of different problems coming together, the socio-technical issues. I'll give you a simple example. A lot of the media literacy, at least in the US, is focused on young people, saying that we need to make them more media literate. But small studies, and their small studies, have shown that the biggest problem in propagating false news is actually older people. Nobody's talking about media literacy for older people because we think they already know this, right? So this is a very complex problem that needs like a much more different solution than we sometimes think. The other issue is there's been a lot of focus on regulating content. Marcus talked about some of the challenges of that. Frank talked about like identifying sites and eliminating them. But that causes a very interesting complication at a society level that we should be very careful about. My suggestion would be to focus more on making the procedures and criteria much more transparent. I would rather spend a lot of energy on understanding how borderline is defined rather than worrying about kind of who takes what down, because I think that's a whole different set of challenges as well. In a lot of these conversations, we don't actually find users. There's a lot of like experts, there's regulators, there's like, pundits like us, but the role of users in having a say, not just saying opt-in or opt-out, but having an appeals process, what is the role of actual users and how do we build them into any of the decision-making process, I think is something that we have to put front and center rather than try to force these solutions from technology or regulatory point of view as well. The other big issue, and again, I think regulators are not focusing enough on this, is kicking and screaming. We've gotten Facebook and Twitter to share some data very selectively with hand-picked research groups in contests or other things. There are initiatives like Social Science One, which has started, but really isn't going anywhere. And the reason they give is because there's a lot of business privacy information that if we give out, then it affects our business. But I think we need to, the idea of self-regulating on data and who they give, what they give, that should be over. I think most of the regulation should be focused on transparency and making sure that this data is much more widely available, because if we don't understand it, our solutions are not going to work. The other issue is I think there's a tendency to kind of solve for these big company problems that worries me about what does it mean for either startups thinking of creating new platforms or even nonprofits. Some of the solutions around saying put 10, 20, I guess now Facebook has 30,000 people addressing content. Seems like for Facebook, it's not a lot of expense really and not a lot of given their scale. But imagine if the similar kind of regulation is put on small companies. They will never get off the ground, and actually When companies tell you that they're welcoming regulation, we should be very, very careful, because I think what they're trying to say is we like this regulation because it also kind of creates and strengthens our current market position. So something to be very, very careful about when big companies say, please bring on some regulation. And then finally, I want to spend a little bit of time on this. A lot of the blame, especially by media, we point the fingers at Facebook and Twitter and others. We point the fingers at regulators. But the reality is that our industry has significantly contributed to misinformation in a variety of ways. Increasingly, studies show that while virality can be blamed on Facebook, Fox News does way more damage than any Facebook or any platform, right? And the media industry is very unwilling to talk about itself, because there's the First Amendment, there's all these protections. And so I think we have to start looking at what is the role of content creators in this. The second issue, and this is a significant issue in the 2016 election in the US, most American newsrooms are male, white, and East Coast based. They did not get the story, right? But it also means that most readers looking at these newsrooms, looking at these bylines, are not seeing the reflection of their diversity in the people who are writing about this. So the trust issue becomes bigger and bigger. That's not going to get solved by having Facebook fix its problems. Media has to look at its own diversity issue and fix that problem as well. So I think the idea of shared responsibility is great. The multi-stakeholder effect is pretty good. But a lot of the multi-stakeholder effects are a bunch of people ganging up on one side and saying to Facebook or somebody else, you fix the problem. I think we have to also look inward and say, we have problems too, and this really requires owning the problem collectively and solving for the problem collectively as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raju. And there's a lot what you say that we recognize also from the discussion within the high-level group, and what we also ended up writing down in the report, like the multi-stakeholder approach, like to give an open of data to do good research and to make a feedback loop and make really sure that you're actually doing the right things with every measure you take. And you also say something about, well, you have to be very careful of platforms wanting to have a form of regulation, because then they will have a better position than other competitors in the market. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think regulation that, like, for example, insists that they have humans curating a lot of the content might seem like a smart idea. And again, for like a Facebook with the kind of revenue they have, or even for Twitter or for the big platforms, throwing a lot of bodies at this seems like a solution. But let's say that becomes regulation, and then you turn to Wikipedia and say, you have to do it too. Mm-hmm. All of Wikimedia's budget is $90 million a year. It's a fraction, right? So if you pose a similar condition on any platform, they will not be able to really do it. And if you're a startup that's trying to start, you have 10 people, very little funding, and you have to begin with the idea that you need 10 people to look at content, then that startup is never going to take off, right? So I think we have to make sure that the regulation fits the size and the current market position as well, even if the activity is the same.
So tailor-made solution. And of course, competition is very good for consumers normally also in this field, and therefore also startups. Okay, I would like to give the floor now the opportunity to say something to this panel. I'm sure that the people in the panel are also really willing and eager to respond to each other. But I've received one question already coming from the floor saying, anonymous, unfortunately, next time please give your name, but okay. What if a given EU member state itself spreads fake news? In general, what can the EU do? And this was also one of the things that we were very concerned for in the high-level group, that also member states tend to play a bit of a difficult role. Who in the panel would like to respond to that? Raju.
I'll just say something about it, which is, again, it fits into this idea that the responsibility is really shared. I think, take Hungary, for example. I think in the last 2-3 years, 400 media companies have all been turned over to a state-controlled, I would say, foundation, right? So this is a real problem. This won't be solved by Facebook if the original content creators are skewing it towards one party or the other. And then how do you solve for that? This has to come at a much higher level from the EU, which has to enforce what seem to exist on paper, rules around press freedom.
Yeah. Marcus.
I think this is a really interesting point, and as much as I sort of sympathize with František's point, and I was really shocked by the numbers that you presented about Russian interference, what we see is that the majority of interference is actually internal interference. And think about the election in Brazil and in other places. So this is a topic that is I think, not completely explored yet, and I think we talked about this earlier, but also one concern we have is actually the behavior of political parties themselves, where I've talked about all these transparency measures that we have in terms of ad transparency. And it is very transparent what happens on the Facebook platform, but we see increasingly that parties actually come off the platform and use one-to-one communication services. And Aris was talking about this, WhatsApp or SMS messages very often to go around this. So, you know, the enemy is very often within, and actually sometimes I wouldn't call it the enemy, but it is also less disciplined policymakers themselves who sometimes pervert the systems and the measures to actually get a grip of the problem.
Yeah, and that would confirm your societal angle, of course, I guess. Would you have something to say on that, Erin?
Yeah, I mean, we know that some governments and political parties around the world do share false, erroneous, conspiratorial, or hyper-partisan content and present it as the truth. So, I mean, if is an interesting way to phrase the question, and it's a good one, too. I mean, does the EU currently take a stand or have conversations or do any kind of peer discussion when that happens?
That's a good one. Well, we've seen some actions, at least towards Poland on that respect. Also, with regard to disinformation, I see a question. I come to you later on. There was a Polish, the regulatory authority in Poland fined the commercial broadcasting organization for 230,000 euros for spreading so-called fake news, but in fact it was criticism towards the government, for instance. And we, as the regulatory authorities, ERGA, acted there. But of course, that's something else. We, as regulatory authority, gave peer pressure towards the regulatory authority there. But the government is quite another story, of course.
Right, and I mean, that's just the concern, that regulatory bodies that do get set up will then themselves be used for malevolent purposes in simply providing an excuse to shut down the content that they don't like or silence dissidents.
Yeah, and therefore it's excellent that the European Union now has, as from last week, the new Audiovisual Media Service Directive, where there are actually guarantees for the independence of regulators against political influence. And I think then regulators could play this buffer role that they're supposed to play and really protect the freedom of information in these media companies. So there's a question over there and someone over there. First, yeah.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for this interesting and very challenging workshops. My question is...
Could you give your name,
my name is Daniel van Lerberg. I'm from Innogage Limited. And I work a lot with media, online media, mainstream online media, like Euractiv, for example. And aren't we victim here a bit of the fact that the media has lost being the fourth pillar of democracy by the fact that now the motto in the status of the journalist went really down, and the motto in main media is publish more, but write less. And the time constraint on the journalists, they don't, I mean, even with the best fact-checking tools, they don't have time anymore to check the facts, to investigate. Investigation journalism is dead. And how today, in the 21st century and with the internet, can we strengthen and reinvent that role of the media that has been totally destroyed, I think, with the need also of continual, I mean, the channels of continual information. So you have to speak, you have to say, you have to find a news. So the role of the journalism, I mean, here is very
clear.
very
Yeah.
important.
So the red race and the difficulties journalists face. I think Sophie is very much positioned to say something about that.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's of course also some of the things that Raju talked about, talking about what's the role of media and traditional journalists in this whole crisis of disinformation. And well, first let me say thank you for media trust. So within this whole crisis, there's always this assumption that media trust has gone down. So people don't have trust in media anymore, in legacy media anymore, the established news media. And if you ask most journalism scholars or media scholars, they will say that's actually not true. Longitudinal studies in the EU show that media trust is actually quite stable over the last years and remains stable. I wouldn't say that's not actually true. I think there is a crisis of trust, but the crisis of trust looks different than we usually think. It's not so easy we can just say everybody loses trust in the media. What we have is a relatively large group of European citizens who still have quite a lot of trust. Actually, studies even show that a large portion of European citizens have increased trust in the media since the fake news crisis, specifically in public broadcasters, because in times of confusion, where do you turn to? You turn to public broadcasting. Not in all European countries, but in some. But that there is an increasingly other neglected group on the fringe who completely check out of the media system. So these are usually, and that's Pew Research, for example, showed that in Western Europe, is people with populist views. So we're not talking about everybody loses trust in the media, or only people on the right, or only people on the left don't trust the media, but it is people with populist views. And these people with populist views don't just distrust the media, but they completely check out of the system, means they don't use the media anymore. And this is the threat to established journalism that's quite feasible for us now, where we have so-called news avoiders. And some of the colleagues Aaron has at the University of Oxford have done a whole study on news avoiders. Why are they doing this? And the two most named reasons for news avoidance are because they make me feel bad, and because I feel I have no influence, I'm not represented. And the feeling I think I've already addressed, this idea that negativity cycles in news have actually damaged during the last decades the credibility of journalism. And the second one is something that you mentioned, which means that media continue to be not diverse. They continue to be run by white men around 40, and this has disenfranchised large portions of the European and global audience. So these are all things that stand outside of this rat race, that are already setting the scene. Then you get all the economic challenges to newspapers and all these things. Rat races, freelancers who have to produce 20 articles a day, who use only digital sources, don't verify, don't have the skills. There we don't know that much yet. So we know that journalists still exist. People still need journalism. People want it. I think that need is there, and but we need to look, and perhaps this is also something regulators can be involved in, to be able to have a media landscape that is diverse enough for people to find themselves. And that will kind of lift the market again for journalism, and therefore give journalism more funding, more time to go back. But kind of sweeping assumptions that, you know, a rat race has led to a decrease in quality of journalism is actually not backed up by any data that's consistent across Europe in democracies that still have press freedom. That's that's the kind of the limitation here. So if there are European countries that have substantially limited press freedom, and there we can talk about decreasing quality, but the democracies that are not yet flagged and highlighted, the quality is actually quite high. So it's more about the question of, is quality journalism actually made for the people who need it?
And we have to avoid self-fulfilling prophecy. There is this gentleman here on the first line, second row.
Thank you very much, Antonio Mendola at AT&T, but I also represent an international NGO of social documentary photography, Issue for Change. I would like to follow up on the last remark by you, and also ask a question to Professor Narizetti. It's one of the problems today is the struggle of the mainstream media to try to demonstrate that they do well their job. I mean, if you're a good journalist, if you do seriously your job, that should be enough. but it's not enough anymore. You have to prove that you're serious, you have to prove that you're accountable, you have to prove it, and keep on prove it, and keep on prove it until you don't know when, right? The problem of fake news, of disinformation, of the quality of journalism, I think, and I'm afraid it plugs into a much more serious scenarios, whereas the more than one government attacks on a daily basis quality journalism, because it's not only a problem of resources of media, because the most attacked media nowadays are the richest one, the more equipped with quality journalists. Look at the CNN, the Washington Post, the New York Times, traditionally great media outlets, right? There's not a problem of resources.
Excuse me, what is your question?
Sorry, yeah. So I would like to ask the Professor Narizetti, which is the role of journalism schools nowadays? Because if you tackle the issue of quality journalism, it's also an issue of how to educate future journalists, future watchdogs. What is the role also in the relation with citizen journalism? Thank you.
I think the good news is that a lot of journalism schools have started talking about misinformation, false information, and teaching young journalists coming out of these schools what that could mean and how to tackle it, especially around deep fakes and use of AI and things like that. So that's kind of the good news. The bad news is that not a lot of journalists are being hired, right? Because it's an industry that's continuing to pull back. So that creates a bit of an interesting challenge as well. I spend a lot of time thinking about business models and teaching journalists about how to think about that. I have a related view, though. I think the unintended consequences of creating a lot of fact-checking independent organizations that are outside the content creation cycle is you're perpetuating this idea that everything that's coming out of media needs to be fact-checked, right? You're actually shifting the burden to readers, while it used to be assumed that content coming out of certain media companies is fact-checked to begin with, right? So it's a very insidious problem that I worry that we might create a situation where everybody thinks everything now needs to be fact-checked because they're telling me that there are 100 fact-checking organizations now. It worries me that that's creating conditions that further undermine the trust in media as well. I'm not sure that, I think I answered the question, though your preamble had lots of other thoughts in it.
Thank you very much. I will take one last question. The lady in the back there, yeah?
I missed a group, I think. My name is Desiree Ehlers. I'm a digital spatial planner. You were saying, I think it was Mrs. Lechler, there's one group that still consumes media and is quite positive about it. Then you have the populist people, and I think there's a third group. That's the passive group that says, I don't no longer want emotions in my media. I stop reading, watching news. I completely skip that. And these are people we are missing because they don't pay for media. They don't pay for media that do go into research and find out things.
What was the question? I think we understood the statement.
It was more a statement than a question, correct? So, given the fact
it was the question about what's about the third group that's not mentioned.
Okay, so
thank you. Sorry.
Shortly. Yeah.
The very short answer is I don't know. One option is the alternative media. Alternative media is a bit of a bad word, but there are actually excellent alternative media, like The Correspondent. That would be one option, but Erin has another idea?
Just to add on to Sophie's point, we don't know. And we need more research to be able to find out, and for that we need more data. And so I wanted to just go back to Marcus's point, and so it's great to hear that kind of discussion of transparency, but that's not something we've seen from Facebook in particular in terms of action. And in fact, we've actually seen, historically, reluctance to acknowledge the problem of disinformation, reluctance to acknowledge the scope, continual revisions. And so Going forward, I mean, transparency, I think, looks like making the efforts currently underway with researchers' work, thinking very seriously about the limitations to the ad archive, and not just making those things available in countries where we're speaking English or our users can generate a lot of revenue, but all over the world. I mean, you also described Facebook as fast, and God, I just thought about the letter from the Myanmar civil society groups criticizing the Facebook's slow response to the tragic Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. And so when it comes to speed, transparency, reluctance, we want to move forward with transparency and with accountability. And that's how we'll be able to answer questions like this that really start to get into the social dynamics of what's going on. And that's not something that Facebook has to do solely internally. That's something we can all do together. That's something researchers, journalists, and third-party academics are eager to do. But we need transparency in action and not just in principle. So we'll look forward to that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think that is a very nice and beautiful last call. I think Facebook cannot solve this alone, but it's very important that Facebook plays a role, and you have tried to show that it is what you want to do, play a role. I would like to conclude this panel by saying that we don't have all the answers, which is obvious. We are needing to do more research. For that, we need independent university institutes to be doing that, to help give the answers. We have to work together with all stakeholders, not just the platforms, but also the media institutions, the journalists, the users. So there is we took one little step now in this year 2018, and we will need to take many more in the coming year 2019. And I don't know about you guys, super curious for the action plan. What will the Commission do? What will they promise to do? And do they give a promise that will be really helpful, or will there also be detrimental aspects to that? And we just have to keep on going on that discussion. So thank you very much. A big hand for this excellent panel. And also thank you very much, excellent audience, for your excellent questions, both online and live. Thank you very much.